Hello everyone, this is Mohitsingh Katoch, working as Assistant Professor in Civil Engineering Department, Tulsiramji Gaikwad-Patil, College of Engineering and Technology, Nagpur. I welcome you all in yet another video of this lecture series, Environmental Engineering 1. The topic which we are going to cover today is intake structures. So without further delay, let's begin with our topic. This particular photograph shows an actual intake structure constructed in a reservoir. An intake structure is used for collecting and admitting water from the surface sources such as river, reservoir or lake. After collection of water, the next step is to convey it further to the water treatment plant with the help of a withdrawal conduit / pipe, which is also known as an intake conduit. An intake is generally a masonry or concrete structure constructed with the aim of providing relatively clean water, which is free from pollution, sand, and other objectionable floating material. Intake structure is constructed at the entrance of the withdrawal conduit, as a result of which it protects the withdrawal conduit from being clogged and damaged by ice, trash, debris, etc. So, to perform tasks such as collection and conveyance of water, an intake structure consists of the following points. Number 1, a conduit with protective work. Number 2, filter screens at open ends. Number 3, gates and valves to regulate the flow of water. These are few actual photographs of some types of intake structures such as canal intake and river intake. In these photographs, we can see dry intake structure and an exposed intake structure. We will study about all these different types of intake structures in detail in the forthcoming slides. But before that, let us have a look at the criteria which should be considered while selecting a suitable site for the intake structure. Point number 1. The site should be so selected that it may admit water even under worst condition of flow in the river or under lowest possible water level in the lake or reservoir. In other words, the intake structure must be able to draw water from the source even during the driest period of the year. Point number 2. The intake site should be as near to the treatment plant as possible in order to reduce the transportation cost. The intake site should admit relatively pure water, which is free from mud, sand, or other floating materials. This means the intake must be located in the pure zone of the source so that best possible quality of water is withdrawn for our usage. The intake site should remain easily accessible during floods, and it should not get flooded, because if it does, then the entire pumping assembly and other important parts will get heavily damaged. The site must be located at a place well protected from rapid currents. The site must have good foundation conditions with least possibility of scoring. The intake site must never be located at a downstream or in the vicinity of the point of disposal of wastewater. The intake site should be located well upstream to the point of discharge of sewage and industrial wastes. These last 2 points are particularly very important because by keeping them in mind, we can avoid the entry of harmful and biologically impure wastewater in our intake water conveyance system. The intake site should never be located near the navigation channels because such water is polluted due to waste discharges from the boats and ships. It should also not interfere with any type of ongoing river traffic. In meandering rivers, the intake should not be located on curves or at least on particularly sharp curves. Last but not the least, there should be enough scope for future expansion of that particular site. So now we will see what are the different types of intake structures available. The intake structures are particularly categorized into different types on the basis of three major criteria. Number one, on the basis of the position of that intake. Number second, on the basis of presence of water in the intake tower. Number third, on the basis of the type of source used for withdrawal of water. So, on the basis of position of intake, there are two types of intake structures. Number one, submerged intake, and number second, exposed intake. On the basis of presence of water in tower, there are two types. Number one, wet intake, and number second, dry intake. On the basis of type of source of water, there are four types. Number one, river intake. Number second, reservoir intake. Number third, lake intake. And number fourth, canal intake. We will now study each of these three categories in detail. Beginning with the first category, that is position of intake. It consists of two types. Number one, submerged intake, and second, exposed intake. A submerged intake, as the name itself suggests, is constructed entirely underwater. It is commonly used to obtain water supply from a lake. The construction of submerged type intake structure is relatively cheaper as compared to other types. It also does not obstruct any type of navigational activities. Submerged intakes are widely used for small water supply projects which are drawing water from lakes having little change in their water level throughout the year. There are high chances of siltation in this type of intakes as they are located underwater. So, to avoid the entry of silt, it is elevated 2 to 3 meters above the lake bed level. The only problem with submerged intakes is their difficult maintenance, as being underwater they are not easily accessible for cleaning and repairing purposes. The following figure shows a typical submerged intake structure. We can clearly see how a grated mesh screen is provided at top of the discharge pipe to avoid the entry of harmful trash and debris which may clog the discharge pipe. An exposed intake is in the form of a well or tower which is constructed near the bank of a river, or in some cases even away from the river banks. Fair amount of structural part of the intake is exposed above the available water level in the source. The exposed intakes are more commonly used in practice as compared to the submerged intakes due to ease in their operation and maintenance. The following figure shows a wet intake tower and a dry intake tower, which falls under the category of exposed intake structures. We can clearly see how some portion of these intake structures is exposed above the available water level. Because of these exposed structures, the cleaning, operation and maintenance of these intakes becomes easier. We will now see the second category of intake structures, which is based on the presence of water in the tower. It consists of two types. Number one, wet intake, and number second, dry intake. Wet intake tower is the one in which water enters from entry ports into the tower and then enters into the conduit pipe through separate gate controlled openings. The water level inside the tower is practically same as the water level at the source of supply. These types of intake structures are sometimes also known as jack well. This type of tower will be full of water even if its gates are closed. The following diagram shows working mechanism of a wet intake tower. The water enters into the intake tower through the entry ports. there is a separate withdrawal conduit located at the center. Water enters in this withdrawal conduit through the gate controlled openings. The control mechanism of these entry gates and ports is located at the top of the tower. Dry intake is the one in which there is no water inside the tower. The water enters directly through the gated entry port into the conveying pipes / withdrawal conduits. When the entry ports are closed, a dry intake tower will be subjected to additional buoyant forces as there is no water available inside. Hence, it must be of a heavier construction as compared to the wet intake tower. A dry intake tower is simply used for the operation of gates and valves which controls the flow of water into the withdrawal conduit. It is also useful since water can be withdrawn from any selected level of the reservoir by opening the entry port present at that particular level. The following figure shows the working mechanism of a dry intake tower. Water directly flows into the withdrawal conduit through the entry ports. This tower is known as dry intake tower as there is no chamber available inside the tower to hold water before entering into the withdrawal conduit, which was available in the case of the wet intake tower. This is the major difference between dry and wet intake tower. Now we will see the third and last category of the intake structure, which is based on the type of source of water. It consists of 4 types: river intake, reservoir intake, lake intake and canal intake. River intake is generally located to the upstream side of the city so that the chances of pollution due to entry of domestic sewage and industrial wastewater is minimized. It is either located sufficiently inside the river so that the demands of water are met in all seasons of the year, or they may be located near the river bank where sufficient depth of water is available. In few cases, an approach channel is constructed and water is led to the intake tower. If the level of water in the river is low, a weir may be constructed across the river to raise the water level and divert it to the intake tower. The river intake tower permits entry of water through several entry ports located at various levels to cope with the fluctuations of water level during different seasons. These entry ports are known as penstocks. The penstocks are covered with suitable design screens to prevent entry of floating impurities. This multi-level penstock system is very useful as the water level will rise during rainy season and will fall to a lower level during dry summer season. With the help of these penstocks, we can utilize the river water throughout the year. Depending upon the layout and river conditions, the river intakes are classified into following 4 types. Number 1, cross weir intake. Second, side weir intake. Third, floating pontoon intake. And fourth, piled crib intake. The following figure shows a typical river intake structure. The important thing to notice in this figure is the multi-level penstock entry system. As we can see, the lowest penstock pipe is placed below the minimum water level in the reservoir. This helps in withdrawing water from the river even during the driest seasons of the year. This is another diagram which shows more clearly how a river intake system works. During highest flood level, valve number 1 will be opened and water will be withdrawn using penstock number 1 located above the lower flood level. And during lowest flood level, valve number 2 will be opened and water will be withdrawn using penstock number 2, which is located below the lower flood level. Reservoir intake. When the flow in the river is not guaranteed throughout the year, a dam is constructed across it to store water in the reservoir formed because of the dam. Reservoir intakes are practically similar to the river intake, except that these are located near the upstream face of the dam where maximum depth of water is available. The design of reservoir intakes depends upon the type of dam constructed. There are number of entry port inlets which are protected by screens. These inlets are located at different elevation levels since water level fluctuates in the reservoir. This entry system enables to draw in relatively clear top water from the near surface of the dam at all seasons. The water level in the tower well is practically same as the reservoir level. The valves of entry ports are operated from the gatehouse located up top. This figure shows a reservoir intake structure. We can clearly see multi-level intake pipe system which is operated using the valves. The lowest inlet pipe is located below the lowest water level in the reservoir. The major portion of the intake structure is located inside the main body of the dam. Lake intake structures are similar to the reservoir intakes if the depth of the water near the banks is reasonable. If, however, the depth of water near the banks is shallow and greater depth is available only at its center, a submersed intake is provided. Submersed intakes are constructed as crypts or bell mouths. The crypts are made up of heavy timber framework which is partially or wholly filled with rocks to protect the intake conduit against damages by waves. The top of the crypt is covered with cast iron or mesh grating to prevent the entry of trash debris. The following figure shows a typical submersed type of lake intake structure. The entry of the inlet pipe is bell mouth shaped. At top, a mesh grating cover is provided which prevents the entry of debris. The entire structure is covered with heavy framework to prevent damages against waves. Sometimes the source of water supply to a small town may be an irrigation canal passing near that particular town. Hence, to utilize water from that canal, an intake structure is constructed over it. It essentially consists of concrete or masonry intake chamber of rectangular shape. Water is admitted into the intake chamber through a coarse screen. Fine screen is provided over the bell mouth entry of the outlet pipe. The bell mouth entry is located below the expected low water level in the canal. Water may flow from the outlet pipe under gravity if the filter house is situated at a lower elevation. The intake chamber must be so constructed that it does not offer any appreciable resistance to the normal water flow in the canal. Even after taking a lot of care, a small amount of floor area in the canal is obstructed by the construction of intake structure, because of which the flow velocity in the canal decreases. So, to prevent the erosion of sides and bed of the channel, the canal should be lined on the upstream and downstream side of the intake structure. The following figure shows a typical canal intake structure. As seen in the figure, a fine screen is provided over the bell mouth entry of the outlet pipe. A coarse screen is provided at the entry point of the intake chamber. Both the coarse as well as fine screens are located below the expected lowest water level in the canal. In this way, we have reached to the end of today's topic. We studied today what is an intake structure and what are its different types. We also studied what are the different criteria which should be considered while selecting a proper site for an intake structure. In the next lecture, we will study about different types of pipe joints and fittings used for transportation of water. Until then, have a nice time and study well. Thank you very much.